solid whack. It hurt, but not too badly. And he said, "You've got something there, Bond out with it." So very reluctantly, I took out As You Like It by William Shakespeare. And he said, "Well, you're not going to like what I'm giving you." I bent over and I got another one. And then he said, "You've still got something in your trousers. So out with it." So from the other side, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I got a hiding for that too. So that was my first introduction to books in a way. But I became a bookworm and was very fond of reading. By the time I finished school.
A little bit about your library, you've written school library.
Have I? Okay, yeah, I'll read about it.
This portion.
Let me get my reading
glasses. Hold this.
These are my Woody Allen glasses. They were given to me by Woody Allen 25 years ago. Believe it or not. Okay. The school library, the Anderson Library, was fairly well stocked, and it was to be something of a haven for me over the next 3 years. There were always writers, past or present, to discover, and I still have a tendency to ferret out writers who have been ignored, neglected, or forgotten. After David Copperfield, the novel that most influenced me was Hugh Walpole's Fortitude, an epic account of another young writer in the making. Its opening line still acts as a clarion call whenever I feel depressed or as though I am getting nowhere. It isn't life that matters, but the courage you bring to it. Walpole's more ambitious works have been forgotten, but his stories and novels of the macabre are still worth reading. Mr. Perrin and Mr. Trail, Portrait of a Man with Red Hair, The White Tower, and of course, Fortitude. I returned to it last year and found it was still stirring stuff.
'42 just spoke about the World War. 42, so that was the time of the Quit India movement and then the freedom movement, partition of India and independence. Any memories associated with the independence movement, the Independence Day?
Yes, 1947.
Yes.
I was still at boarding school. I was 13 years old. And of course, independence came along and there was a good deal of celebration. And I remember the Indian flag going up on the school field. And then suddenly it was followed by the partition of Punjab into two areas. Part of it went to Pakistan. Then the same with Bengal. Part became East Pakistan. And we had in our school at least about would it be easier with this? Yeah. Can you hear me? Is that better? Thank you. Yes, about 1/3 of our school boys were from places like Lahore and Rawalpindi, which now fell into Pakistan. So they had to be evacuated overnight. There were a lot of trouble and rioting, and as you read in your history books, there was a great deal of loss of life too. So at some risk, they were evacuated and got home safely. But that reduced the school's numbers very dramatically. And it took some time for not only my old school, Bishop Cotton, but other hill schools, boarding schools, to actually recover from that traumatic period. And then, of course, the country gradually got back to normal, and in the Nehru years, there was a good deal of development and progress. And so I've seen it all happening. Now I'm 86, and I think at least 82 of those years have been spent in this our country.
So going back to your childhood, lots of very famous aunts and uncles. I think Uncle Ken is more famous than Ajit Pawar's uncle.
Sorry?
Your aunts and uncles in the stories, are they all real or some are made up?
That's true.
Aunt Ruby,
a lot of aunts and
Uncle
uncles,
Ken.
thank you, do appear in my stories. Some of them I make up. Some are based on real aunts and uncles. Whenever I'm sort of running out of ideas and want to write a funny story, I dig up some old uncle or aunt and make sure that they're very far away in some other country. I don't have any relatives here, at least not blood relatives. And so it's pretty well safe to write about them. But when I run out of relatives, I write ghost stories. And although...
I think we can move to the ghost towards later. I wanted to know about Mr. Uncle Ken when he goes to Lucknow for the match. And he's confused with some famous cricketer.
My Uncle Ken used to do crazy
Yeah, the famous
things,
Uncle
right?
Ken.
He arrived in Lucknow to see a cricket match, and he used to look a bit like the cricketer called Jeff Boycott. And Jeff Boycott couldn't arrive that day at the ground for some reason. So somebody got hold of Uncle Ken and said, "You're Boycott, aren't you?" And Uncle Ken, who never refused to be anything, he agreed. And he put on a pair of pads and they gave him a bat and he walked out to play. And the first ball went off his pads and went for 4 runs. And on the second, he got run out. But anyway, everybody was pleased that they'd seen Jeff Boycott, and nobody was any the wiser.
And the grandfathers? Grandfather, the owls in the family.
Yes.
So what the grandfather had to wear to look after those oils. From here in response to... So how did it happen? How did these owls get in the family?
Well, the owl fell out of a tree.
Oh, fell out of a tree.
The owl's offspring fell out of a tree, and they were looked after by my grandfather.
Your grandfather, yeah.
Up here.
Yeah, suppose it's the interesting part.
Forgetful of the fact that grandfather and I had reared them, the owls would sometimes swell their feathers and snap at anyone in trousers.
Anyone in trousers?
To avoid displeasing them, grandfather wore a petticoat at feeding time. This mild form of transvestitism appeared to satisfy them. And I compromised by wearing an apron. In response to grandmother's voice, the owlets would make sounds as gentle and soothing as the purring of a cat. But when wild owls were around, ours would rend the night with curdling shrieks. Their nightly occupation was catching beetles, with which the kitchen quarters were infested at that time. With their sharp eyes and powerful beaks, they were excellent pest destroyers.
So how long did they stay, these owls? They stayed with you or?
Well, for some time, yes. My grandfather had the habit of picking up unusual animals and keeping them as pets, and they ranged fairly widely. My grandmother certainly disapproved because it meant a lot of work for her. But a lot of these stories actually came to me later from my mother, reminiscing about her childhood, because I was actually just a baby, an infant, when my grandfather died. So I didn't really know him personally. But being a writer, I make up things. I'm the world's greatest liar, so don't believe half the things I tell you.
No, you see, you feel safe and write about relatives who are far away. You can share that, huh?
Which one?
Relatives who stay far away, you make stories about them.
Yes.
So that they don't get... Why do you write about relatives who are far away from you?
Well, so they can't get at me, I suppose. Yeah.
He says, I write stories about relatives who stay very far off, so they can't get back at me. So you can write things about them.
Well, Basically, I'm a fiction writer, so I'm allowed to tell a few lies now and then.
People and critics and your people who love your poetry, they call you our very own Wordsworth.
Well, Wordsworth was not a poet I particularly enjoyed having to study.
Yes.
Actually, when you're at school and you rather resent having to study a particular author. I remember I did. And so when somebody says, I'm a Wordsworth or a Kipling, I recall the fact that I never really enjoyed reading them. Till much later, because I remember I had to study Kim at school and did not enjoy having to study it. But 10 years after leaving school, I came across it, picked it up, and thoroughly enjoyed the book. So sometimes the fact that we have to study a work and do an exam on it takes away some of the pleasure from reading it. But nevertheless, we have to, that's the best way of getting acquainted with an author or a book, is actually to study it properly.
But I do feel that you go beyond Wordsworth. Wordsworth wrote about nature, he painted nature, you write through nature. The kind of empathy you share with nature, you don't find that empathy in Wordsworth. He just describes it very beautifully. So daffodils, he hears something, solitary reaper, he'll write about it. He saw daffodils, he writes about them. But you take nature as a part of you.
Nature
You have an empathy for nature, which I don't think, Wordsworth never wrote about snails and bats and chameleons and beetles and fireflies.
Well, you wouldn't have got half those creatures in England anyway. I think we have far more wildlife in India, both insect life as well as on the bigger scale.
But these small creatures, there's this little thing about bat.
And if you go and live in a cottage in the hills, as I did for many years, and it's close to the forest, you're bound to come into contact with all kinds of creatures, birds, beetles, foxes. I remember the first time I saw a fox. It was actually dancing in the moonlight on the path going down to my cottage. And I wrote a little poem about it. And since this is one of the few poems I remember.
You remember, please.
I'll
With pleasure, yeah. The lone fox dancing you're talking about?
Oh, that's right. As I walked home last night, I saw a lone fox dancing in the bright moonlight. I stood and watched, then took the low road, knowing the night was his by right. Sometimes when words ring true, I'm like a lone fox dancing in the morning dew. So that was it. Thank you.
This is exactly what I meant. This empathy with nature, with creatures big and small. Writing it so beautifully that the night was his by right. So that kind of touch you will not find in Wordsworth or any other nature poet. That is so much, so uniquely Ruskin Bond. About a bat. Who would write about a bat?
Oh, yes, I loved it. The bat was one of the creatures who used to visit the cottage. Most bats fly high, swooping only to take some insect on the wing. But there's a bat I know who flies so low he skims the floor. He does not enter at the window, but flies in at the door. Does stunts beneath the furniture. Is his radar wrong, or does he just prefer being different from other bats? And when sometimes he settles upside down at the foot of my bed, I let him be. On lonely nights, even a crazy bat is company. Thank you. Thank you.
So beautiful.
Thank you. I called my autobiography Lone Fox Dancing. And when it was launched, the interviewer on one of our channels got the title mixed up and kept referring to as Lone Wolf Dancing. and I had to tell her that, I'm sorry, miss, but I'm not a wolf. I don't mind being called a fox.
There is another very beautiful story where you see a leopard And it becomes a kind of, you develop an empathy for it.
Yes.
You go looking for it. But one day when you're walking down the road, you see what you see.
Where do you like?
Can you just little bit from here? Because next day.
True. This story of the leopard, which has gone into several Ratna Saga collections, is a popular one. But next day, coming up the path from the stream, shouting and beating their drums, were the hunters. They had a long bamboo pole across their shoulders, and slung from the pole, feet up, head down, was the lifeless body of the leopard. It had been shot in the neck and in the head. "We told you there was a leopard," they shouted. In great good humor, "Isn't he a fine specimen?" "Yes," I said, "he was a beautiful leopard." I walked home through the silent forest. It was very silent, almost as though the birds and animals knew their trust had been violated. And I remembered the lines of a poem by D.H. Lawrence, and as I climbed the steep and lonely path to my home, these words echoed in my mind. "There was room in the world for a mountain lion and me." Those last lines were from the Lawrence poem.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, being part of nature, I think ghosts are part of nature. Somebody asked for a ghost story. Do you believe in ghosts? Have you seen them?
I don't believe in ghosts, but I keep seeing them. Thank you. Thank you. And I cook up a few too, and kids seem to like ghost stories, although usually their parents disapprove of them. But it's a sort of safe fear. You scare yourself, but you know at the back of your mind that it's not really happening. It's not true. Except that there is a very friendly, motherly ghost who visits me late at night. Sometimes I have difficulty sleeping, and I toss and turn, and the rizai or the blanket falls off my bed, particularly on cold nights in the hills. And then I'm aware of somebody picking them up, putting them back on me, tucking me into bed, and I switch on the light, there's nobody there. So it's probably a very motherly and a friendly ghost. See, my ghosts are not frightening, they're helpful, they're nice people. Thank you.
Yeah, they're too friendly, I think.
Except for the girl, the schoolboy who had no face, the one, the face in the dark.
The face in the dark.
The boy that Mr. Oliver, the teacher, encountered, and he had
Mr. Oliver.
no eyes, no nose, no mouth. It was just a face. I think, having been a teacher for dozens of years, year after year, all boys began to look the same. So one day he just saw one who had no face at all. And he got so scared, he ran into the schoolyard. It was late at night, and the chowkidar was there with a lantern, and he said, the chowkidar said, "What's wrong, sir? Why are you scared?" And Mr. Oliver, the teacher, said, "I've just seen this boy, and he had no eyes, no nose, no mouth, no face at all." And the chowkidar said, "Was he like this, sir?" And he raised the lamp to his own face, and he had no eyes, no nose, no mouth. What? Which is when Mr. Oliver had his heart attack. Thank you.
But there's this beautiful story, the overcoat, where you meet a girl at a party, and then when you leave the party early, and then she starts shivering. So he says he lent his overcoat to her because she's shivering, and then you drop her at her house. Then the next day you go looking for her.
Yes.
Yeah. So if you could read from here. She did not.
Yes, I'd.
From here.
Yes, I walked around the hill to the mission house where the Taylors lived and asked old Mrs. Taylor if she knew a girl called Julie.
Julie was the name of the girl at the party.
The one who'd borrowed my overcoat, or to whom I'd lent it. "No, I don't think so," she said. "Where does she live?" "At Wolfsburn," I was told, "but the house is just a ruin now." No one's lived there for over 40 years, she said. The McKinnons lived there, one of the old families who settled here. But when their girl died, she stopped and gave me a queer look. I think her name is Julie. Anyway, when she died, they sold the house and it fell into decay. But it couldn't be the same Julie you're looking for. She died of consumption. There wasn't much you could do about it in those days, and her grave is in the cemetery just down the road. I thanked Mrs. Taylor and walked slowly down the road to the cemetery, not really wanting to know any more, but propelled forward almost against my will. It was a small cemetery under the Devdars. You could see the eternal snows of the Himalaya standing out against the pristine blue of the sky. Here lay the bones of forgotten empire builders, soldiers, merchants, adventurers, their wives and children. It did not take me long to find Julie's grave. It had a simple headstone with her name clearly outlined on it. Julie McKinnon, 1923 to 1939. With us one moment, taken the next, gone to her maker, gone to her rest. Although many monsoons had swept across the cemetery, wearing down the stones, they had not touched this little tombstone. I was turning to leave when I caught a glimpse of something familiar behind the headstone. I walked round to where it lay, and neatly folded on the grass was my overcoat, which he'd returned. Thank you.
Some more ghost stories?
No,
No? Will Ashley return?
I don't think they need one. There was something white flitting around at the back in the white robe. Nothing.
Actually, in one of our similar programs, so Mr. Bond was on the stage with somebody else. I was moving around the hall. And then one kid asks him, Mr. Bond, do you believe in ghosts? So he says, no, I don't, but I can see a lady in a white sari moving around in the hall. After that, I had stopped wearing a white sari to his program.
Wearing it today?
I wore with flowers.
No, it's another one.
Flowers on it. You can move from ghosts to sports.
To the fox and
From to sports, I said? Your interest in sports as from childhood?
Yes, and
Till watching and playing and
I was great.
writing?
Yeah, I love playing football, right, true. And, but I did not care for the marathon, very long races. So I used to, naturally, everything was compulsory in a boarding school. So running the marathon was included, but I would stop along the way to eat roasted corn or toffee and things that were available, and would usually come in last in the race, and be greeted by my headmaster, who would say, "Well done, Bond, you're first in the next race," which is that.
That's a good one. You're first in the next race.
Yeah, that was first
for coming last.
Correct.
Good way of putting it.
And because, you see, when I finished school in 1950, Hindi had just been introduced as a compulsory subject. And even nobody in the school knew Hindi, none of the teachers or the staff. But they'd engaged a Sikh gentleman who'd come in from Punjab, and as a Hindi teacher, and he taught us Hindi for the year. That year we had what was called the Junior Cambridge exam, and everyone failed in Hindi. And then they realized our teacher didn't know Hindi either. He'd been teaching us Punjabi. And next year they got a real Hindi teacher, but who gave up on me when I gave him my translation of the Charge of the Light Brigade. You know how it goes in English? Half a league, half a league, half a league onward. Into the valley of death rode the 600. So I recited, Aadha mil, aadha mil, aadha mil aage, 600 aadmi ghora pe bhage. and got failed instantly for having the wrong grammar. So when I want to make people laugh, I give them a Hindi couplet. Thank you.
You played football, but you watched cricket.
Cricket, nobody kept me in the team because I didn't believe in running between the wickets. I thought it was far too much exertion. I thought, so I like this T20. You just hit the ball and let it go for a 6 or a 4. You know, you don't have to do much running up and down. But then when I was at school, so they always made me 12th man, so I could do the fielding when the star batsman felt like a rest, or I would carry out the drinks and the sandwiches. I usually took my revenge by consuming all the sandwiches before they got to the players.
But you were a fan of Sachin. You're a fan of Sachin.
Yeah, I once
You wrote this poem about Sachin.
Yeah, this is the only place it's been published.
Yeah, I don't think anyone else has written a poem on Sachin Tendulkar. You're all such great fans.
It's only in the Ratna Sagar reader because nobody else would pay me for the poem. So it's called When Sachin Walks Out to Bat. There's a hush around the ground, and then the deafening sound of many voices raised to fever pitch. As one young man steps out, his bat in hand, he gives a little hitch of shoulders as he takes his stance, then gives the waiting field a glance of friendly favor, for he's not one to fret or look askance at hostile fielders near the bat. He's used to that. Well focused on the ball, not bowler. Its spin or swing won't trouble him. He just steps out and gives the ball a handsome clout. No, it's not so simple. Years of practice have gone into that shot, that clip past point, that drive to cover, that lofted 6 into the crowd. Not too humble, not too proud. He strikes a balance, as with grace in this great game, he holds his place. What is his secret? What's his plan? What makes this boy a wonder man? The answer, friend, is all too plain. He truly learnt to love the game. So I think
That's it.
you have to love
That's
something
it
in
about
order
life.
to do it well.
That's it.
And I love writing, which is what I've been doing for the last 65 years plus. And I think I'm getting a little better at it from year to year.
Little better. You just mentioned that Ratna Sagar took this poem.
But you can't be perfect. No. And you can aim for perfection. That you have to do.
Our founder and Dr. Jain, your friend, he would say if you are selecting a Ruskin Bond poem or a passage for any book, please ensure that the other pieces, whether it's Dickens or anybody, should be up to that mark. The language should be as beautiful. The writing should flow as well. So I tell the editors there's a Bond benchmark for the books. So if you have his work, then please ensure that the other lessons are also as good. What's the secret of your simple writing? You create a scene. Yesterday we met a educationist who said, I think she said that I've never been to the Himalayas. She's from Bangalore. I think the lady will be here. But I feel I've known the Himalayas all my life through your reading. So how does that happen, that flow of language and that imagination?
Well, it's not just a matter of simple language, but I would say using the correct word for whatever you want to say. I was lucky in that I had 1 or 2 good teachers at school who did help me with my writing, with my style and grammar, and always told me that you must respect the language you write in. Whether you're going to write in English or in Tamil or in Hindi or Bengali, you should have a good foundation and love the language, and then you'll write well. And this particular teacher was Mr. Jones. He wasn't actually the best teacher in my school, in my humble opinion. He was unqualified. He had done a teacher training, which turned into a good teacher, but he hadn't taken any degrees, with the result that he didn't get a good promotion and always remained a junior teacher. But he was one of the best because I think he used to read to us, and he loved reading. He taught English, and he loved reading Dickens and other good writers. And that was one way in which we learned to, in a way, appreciate those literary works, because if they were read out to you in class, it was better than having to sort of go and read them yourself in homework. You got sort of involved in it.
But how is the language so evocative? How do you make it so evocative? How does it come from? You revise many drafts, or it just comes
No, I think
as a first?
Today, there are a lot of youngsters I keep meeting who want to write and who do write. They're always asking me for tips or advice. And I tell them there's just only one good way in which to be a good writer, and that's to be a good reader. If you're fond of books, if you love reading, if you love other writers, you will also be a good writer. But it's, I think, very difficult to be a writer if you're not a reader. And so I always urge youngsters, and it's amazing the number of young people nowadays who want to write. And this was not the case when I finished school. It certainly wasn't a glamorous profession then. And I remember 1950, I did my senior, it was called Senior Cambridge. It was rather like your Indian school certificate. And I came home, and in fact, that was the end of my formal education, because I never went to college or university. I started writing straight away. And when I came home and my mother asked me, now, what are you going to do with yourself, Ruskin? And I said, Mom, I think I'm going to be a writer. And she said, don't be silly, go and join the army. In those days, everyone went into the army. It was, in fact, the first choice for school-leaving boys, because you were rather limited to the sort of professions you could go in for back in 1950. And today, children have such a wide choice of careers before them, but the competition is also very great. So the pressure on youngsters today is pretty strong, I should think.
But your father was in the Air Force. Your father was in the Royal Air Force?
During the World War II.
During the World War II, yeah. So you didn't get to spend much time with him?
No, yes, he did. The last 2 years of his life was spent with me because he was then posted in Delhi. And because my parents had separated, I was being looked after by my father. And for 2 years, 2 wonderful years, I have to confess, I didn't go to school. So I had a gap of 2 years in my school life, which didn't seem to make any difference, because when I did finally go to a school in the hills, I got a double promotion. So I think I benefited in a way from being at home, because my father, being a teacher, used to encourage me to read. He was an avid stamp collector, so from his collection I would learn geography. He would take me to all the monuments in Delhi, the Qutub Minar, the Red Fort, Chandni Chowk, everywhere, and tell me the story and the history behind them. So I learned history, I learned geography, I learned English, all from my father when I was 7, 8 years old. And then he died a year or two later, but he'd already given me the foundations for for a long life, for a long literary life, and also a very fulfilling one.
It's most important, the foundation. Have some water? Yeah. Would you like some?
No, that's fine.
It all boils down to the foundation. The foundation is strong, or your interests are diverted in one direction. So children do, I mean, they're all educationally eminent ones.
Yes, I think I think those early years, I think by the time we are 5 or 6 years old, we have become what we are going to be for the rest of our lives, in a way, in terms of character and personality. Of course, we lose our innocence very soon, and perhaps today more than we used to. But children haven't changed, really, basically. Maybe we've gone into a highly technological age, but the basic instincts are the same. And I think every boy likes games, he likes to eat, he likes adventure. And girls, they have their own, they like to read, they like to dress, they like to look pretty, and why shouldn't they?
Getting back to language, I mean, personally, I would say a phrase like the benedictory pines. I would sacrifice any solitary reaper or daffodils for this one beautiful phrase, the benedictory pines. How do you come up with such beautiful language? This living with the mountains, this poem, I mean, that has stayed with me. When I think of pines, I think of benediction.
Yes, once you have lived with mountains, under the benedictory pines and deodars, near stars and a brighter moon, with wood smoke and mist, sweet smell of grass, dew lines on spider spun, sun-kissed buttercup and vine, once you have lived with these, blessed, God's favorite then, you will return, you will come back to touch the trees and grass and climb once more the wind-swept mountain pass.
This one,
Thank you.
this one poem can be a full lesson on adjectives. That can, I mean, you can take a short poem like this, and there's such beautiful adjectives over here. We can
Thank you.
teach from this, yeah.
I write poems whenever now and then. It's hard, you can't make a living writing poetry, so I squeeze them in between all the other things I write.
So I was looking for something else that we could read on, it's in book 8. Where's it on? Yeah. This in being Indian, this being Indian, these days there's a lot of debate on nationalism. We lay a lot of force on nationalism war. Who is a true Indian? What is a true Indian? Who is Indian? I mean, who can define who is Indian? Mr. Bond wrote something, I think, how many years ago?
Oh, yes, I wrote this little essay or middle for one of our newspapers back in the 1980s. And it's still around, and it's also preserved in one of the Ratnasagar readers. And,
It's my favorite.
So I thought it would vanish, but it hasn't. And I think it applies as much today as it did when I wrote it.
I think it applies much more today.
There are many among us who, given the opportunity to leave India, are only too happy to go. But whenever I've had the chance to go away, I have held back, or something has held me back. What is it that has such a hold on me, but leaves others free to go where they will, sometimes never to return? Many years ago, I was offered a well-paid job at a magazine in Hong Kong. I thought about it for